Hello and welcome to week 5 of Self, Identity and Agency. Our focus this week is on this tension between two ideas. The first is the story that we've been developing in previous weeks. So that was very much a story about efforts to set out a universal theory or set of theories about what it means to be a human being. So the emphasis there was what we share as humans, and the impulse was to accentuate and really talk to our sense of sameness. From next week on, what we are going to be picking up on and exploring is this idea of difference. So there is a tension between sameness and difference that marks this course as a whole, and I guess this week is the pivot point from where we go from one set of considerations toward another. So what I want to do this week is set out that shift and provide a bit of background and I guess to reflection on why it is or what we should take from the discussion thus far. This week, what we're doing is, as I said, marking this shift from our primary interest in theories seeking universal accounts to ones that consider ideas of difference. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about identity itself and the sort of categories we use when thinking about and expressing our sense of identity and marking and noting others' identities. Before, I guess, capturing or hopefully reflecting the way that they come together, these different categories can come together and intersect, and that's an important word, in interesting and important ways. Finally, I want to say a little bit about this sort of meta category or general category of quote unquote the other as a way of thinking about language, power, and privilege, especially through the way that language, power, and privilege can combine to marginalise particular experiences of self. So again, very much this week, as I said, is about marking this shift from one or a collection of ways and attempts to tell a universal story to one that picks up and accentuates and explores our differences. Okay, so universalism, as I said, has been this theme that's run through the course to date. And I think it might be worth just spending a moment sort of summarising some of those different lines of argument before considering the implications of them, because these are powerful ideas, and they're ideas that continue to very much shape our world today. So just pausing for a moment, I guess, and reflecting on them, I think can be quite useful. I think rather than trying to sort of then boil it down to some ultimate judgment about how we should think about universalism, like a lot of the concepts we cover in this course, I think it's probably more useful to think of it as representing a tension between potential and limitations, so that the things that these phenomena offer us, but also the perhaps the concerns that come along with using them. So universalism is a big idea, but as I said, it's capturing this notion that we are trying to, in the context that we're using it, we're trying to tell a story that's applicable to all people. And as we've said, that this is a story that, as we understand it, originated during that Enlightenment period in the 1700s in Western Europe, and then sort of gravitated outward across the world. And as I said, this idea has its some potential, some considerable sort of benefits to it, but it also has some limitations. And I guess what I've tried to do in a really simple way is just use this table here to illustrate some of those tensions. So from a potential point of view, the benefit that we could associate with universalism, I think one of its strengths is that it actually gives us a language for talking about humanity as a whole. So in that language then, we can then start to craft and think about, both philosophically and practically, the way we interact and engage with other people. So the language of human rights, for instance, something that in many ways marked as a political sort of high point of the 20th century, this language at its very core presupposes an ability to think about human beings as sharing these common qualities and traits and experiences, a sense of human dignity that needs to be respected and understood accordingly. So that's a strength to it. It also gives us a normative framework. So normative means a framework about values for thinking about social institutions. So we live in a world that is structured and we experience the world through social institutions. So when we talk about things like qualities like fairness or justice and respect, those too come back to this universal idea. That the idea that no matter who you are in these systems, you deserve to be treated in the same way. So sameness there being given a very deliberate sort of expression. Universalism also gives us a foundation, an empirical foundation for research and social inquiry more generally. So this was the idea that the same set of tools can be used to explore the complexity and richness of human life. Representations or technologies like science and different forms of human inquiry could then be built upon and developed over time, captured in things like encyclopedias and works of reference. So from the Enlightenment perspective, from this drive to understanding and knowledge through the application of reason, you could understand the world in increasingly complex and nuanced ways. I think what universalism, in a general sense, also gives us is that it stresses the relationships between all people in the world in which we live. So we live in a world now, I guess it's very apparent that we live in a world now, that changes in one part of the world can have profound knock-on effects for the rest of the world. And if we're thinking about global pandemics or issues of climate change or whatever it might be, having a language that stresses our humanity and these shared experiences and shared challenges can be quite useful in that regard. But there are limitations, and I guess the limitations I've represented here sort of map onto and potentially critique those potentials as well. So one challenge to this idea that language of universalism can often privilege certain expressions of self and then offers them up as applicable to all people everywhere. For example, the Enlightenment story that we've been developing in previous weeks very much frames, quote unquote, the individual as the basic unit of analysis. What's never quite made clear is when the rest of the world agreed to that idea. It was simply asserted and then argued for its self-evident truthfulness, if that makes sense in this context. So thinking about where these ideas come from is an important way, not so much of just pulling the rug out from under them, but thinking of them as originating in particular contexts, perhaps originating from particular debates or a particular world in which they first emerged. And whether the challenge then is to think about that being applicable in very different contexts at different times and different locations. I talked about it being a normative framework, but again, are these norms that are being expressed universally understood and accepted? And this too goes back to that idea of human rights more generally. So from the emergence of this explicit language of human rights, an argument has been made as to whether these are in fact human rights or a particular set of Western ideas that are then being generalised to humanity as a whole. The idea or the argument about the empirical foundations that universalism offers us allows us to also, I guess, dig into this idea that is it in fact the case that the rules that govern the natural world are in fact applicable to the social world as well? Can we use the tools and strategies, the sort of underlying logic of a discipline like physics when thinking about a practice like politics? Or from that, I guess, can we or should we, I guess, is the other part that comes with that. I think the other thing too, as a sort of a pushback against this idea of our shared human experience, so that while in one sense we can absolutely acknowledge that these relationships happen, it's also worth noting, I guess, that we live in a world that is staggeringly uneven in its distribution of resources and opportunities. So the argument that we're all in this together, in one sort of really superficial way, may in fact be absolutely true. in terms of the lived reality of these experiences, it can be very, very different depending on where you are in relation to those resources and opportunities I've alluded to a moment ago. So these are very much big picture sort of accounts of how we might think about both what universalism offers us, but also some of the challenges or the limitations of these ideas. It also works at a more subtle level too, and this, I guess what I'm getting at here is that it informs our thinking, and the use of this language encourages us to think about ourselves and the world in particular ways. What it also routinely does is reinforce this idea of normality, that the universal, that the emphasis on sameness sort of captures something that's normal, as opposed to something that is abnormal or dangerous. So again, if you think back to that idea of binary logic that we've been talking about at different points during the course to date, I think that gets us into that sort of headspace. Think about how often we use terms like normal or average, typical or ordinary to capture what in many ways may in fact be a very limited account of what it means to be human, but the language itself encourages us to sort of generalize or radiate out that experience of the world to others. So in doing that, what that language is in fact doing is marking a sense of inclusion and exclusion to a particular group. It's also interesting, I think, when we think about normal, average, typical, ordinary, to think of that in the context of development. So this idea about how we become a human being, how we become the people we are, has been this recurring theme in this course, as has an emphasis and an interest on children and children's development too. So again, think about how we understand childhood today, the kind of measures we apply, the comparisons we make between individual children against this sort of generalised abstraction of normal, average, typical or ordinary. And the tremendous anxiety that often comes with making those sorts of judgments, or the sort of false confidence that often comes from being able to position yourself within those clusters or those ideas. So again, I guess to pull some of that, to pull some key ideas out of that, is that this idea of language becomes really important. And in a lot of ways, language marks, an interest in language marks another dimension as this, or in this shift from the first half of the course to the second. So being mindful of language and the way that it can construct particular categories makes us, I guess, aware of the complexity and, how's this for a word, multifacetedness of how we see ourselves and others. While it's sometimes easy to look at another person and to reduce them to a particular identity marker, and we potentially do this all the time, we can also, with a little bit of reflection, thought and consideration, we can see that complexity in others as well. And I guess we hope that others see it in us. But again, there is a tension here between a sense of belonging that emerges through inclusion. So I'm part of this group, this binds me to this group. And in feeling part of this group, we naturally then will tend to exclude others. We draw a boundary or set some kind of parameter about who is granted access and who can be rejected from that group. It's a very human process, if we go back to generalised ways of thinking. But it's something I think that we often participate in, but often don't reflect on what it is we're doing at those particular moments. When we do reflect, though, I think it's a great place for thinking about how power works. And that ability to state and have that statement received by others about who we are and where we fit. And again, recognising that not all people have that same ability to self-label themselves in that kind of way. So what's also happening here, I guess, is that we're now also making a shift, sort of a more subtle shift, in thinking about meaning and the relationship between meaning and sense-making, and identity. So how it is we think about ourselves. Benjamin Hale's sort of terrific story, The Evolution of Bruno Littlemore, captures this really well, I think. So in this sense, he's making a claim about something universal, but also something incredibly fragile. And he says, we, and I mean humans, are meaning makers. We do not discover the meanings of mysterious things, we invent them. We make meanings because meaningless terrifies us above all things, more than snakes even, more than falling or the dark. We trick ourselves into seeing meanings in things when in fact all we are doing is grafting our meanings onto the universe to comfort ourselves. We gild the chaos of the universe with our symbols. To admit that something is meaningless is just like falling backwards into darkness. So this idea that part of the human experience, for better or worse, is to impose these meanings. And next week, when we talk about the social construction of race, I think we have a terrific case study for thinking about how that can go so terribly, terribly wrong. But in the meantime, what we need to then get into the headspace of doing is starting to think about these categories of identity and the way that we can build versions of ourselves by consideration of them, by their multifacetedness, so the way that they interact, and by the importance of context, so that in some ways, at some moments, some of these will be very apparent and we will use them to tell a very clear assertion to the world of who we are and where we fit, where we belong, and at other times they will be downplayed. There's nothing self-evident or obvious about how that works in practice, but it captures, I guess, some of the sort of diversity of ideas that we're going to be exploring in the second half of the semester. Race, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, so that we're using that as a fancy way of talking about social class and those sort of economic differences that very much mark our experience of the world. Disability, location, sexuality, gender and age. Many of these, in one way or another, will feature as weekly topics, but they'll also mark sort of threads that will run through this second half of the semester. So thinking about sameness and difference, what I don't want to do is think or present this as an argument in which the first half of the course was all about sameness and sameness alone, and the second half is all about difference and diversity in and of itself. If you look at this week's readings, I think Jenkins gives us an interesting take on this relationship between sameness and difference. And I won't go on to sort of summarise the whole thing, but the thumbnail version of it is his argument that these two experiences of the world are inseparable, that it's kind of meaningless to try to think about a human being as not constantly engaging in these experiences of seeking out sameness and marking and or recognising difference. That doesn't mean it always unfolds in the same sorts of way, but that they're bound together. For us, I think the important thing here, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is that language is important. So to see yourself as an X, and fill in X as to whatever it is you want it to be, is to participate in the construction and the continuation of these categories. Now, I need to be really careful about what I'm suggesting here, because I'm not suggesting that this is another or a sort of a veiled way of talking about victim blaming, or that, you are in this group and you're in this group forevermore, but more to draw our attention to the fact that language is sort of all we have if we think about language broadly. So our language is both connecting, but it's also constructing that world around us. Or as Hale says, it's about imposing those meanings on that external world. And we're often desperate to make those kinds of impositions. But it can also be understood through implication. So if I have 3 kids and Michelle's the quote-unquote athletic one, then this tells me a lot, or tells you or us a lot about my understanding of what Michelle is. But it's also about what her siblings are not. So this idea that in language too, we're constantly revealing and concealing. By implication, and we understand the logic of those kind of statements, gives us again another vantage point for thinking about sameness and difference, or similarity and difference. That was very much about thinking of these things in isolation. Where it becomes interesting and more powerful too is that when we think about how they combine to offer us different points for capturing the complexity of modern identity. So, for example, think about a designator like straight white male. So this is a sort of expression you hear all the time. What do you think of? Well, what comes to mind when you hear that phrase? This tweet from a couple of years ago, I just adore it because they snarkily say, people are so easily offended these days. That's why I only ever make jokes at the expense of white men whose thick skins and calm rationale attitudes make them impossible to be upset. So, thinking about straight white men, do you think of calm rationality and attitudes that make them impossible to upset, or is it something else? Again, the combinations are what matter. More seriously, though, thinking about these combinations can then also help us to uncover and reveal some really significant and powerful relationships that underpin many institutions and experiences in our modern world. So intersectionality is one way of developing a framework for doing this kind of thinking. I won't linger too long in this because I want this part of the discussion to continue into the online discussion space in Canvas. But just to maybe give a definition of what we mean by intersectionality and then use that again to bridge where we're going to be headed in coming weeks. So Romero describes intersectional analysis as identifying social identities or social hierarchies and examining the systems of inequality that dominate particular social settings and social relationships, I should say. Power relationships in settings differ between individuals and groups, and at times privilege race, but in other settings, class privilege is more pronounced. Intersectional analysis requires uncovering power, privilege, and opportunity structures and examining their link to social identities. The point, I guess, with intersectional ways of thinking or intersectional analysis is, I guess, described or captured here in a quite abstract way, but there's a very concrete sort of examples of the way that these things work as well. And I guess what the snarky quote I used on the previous slide is trying to capture is this sense that they combine to potentially reinforce privilege, but also to accentuate disadvantage as well. So the straight white male cluster of ideas are in our society and the way that we organise our society primed to give someone a very explicit set of advantages for the working and experience of how our social world works. So what we see in intersectionality and the analysis that comes from this idea is a way of unpacking and thinking about the underlying logic of that compounding, that sort of welding together of these particular experiences of identity to offer privilege in some cases, but tremendous disadvantage in others. And that it's often not enough to talk about race or class or gender or whatever. Well, no, you can talk about them in that way, but when you start to blend them together and to think about how they intersect and how they relate to each other can open up a lot more or many more opportunities for thinking about these things. Okay, so I've said previously that language is important for thinking about these ideas. And I've also stressed this idea that identity is a relational idea. So I am me, I am able to assert my me-ness by the fact that there is somebody who is not me. There is somebody who understands themselves in profoundly different ways. So it's that give and take, that sort of set of relationships that come out of this idea of identity that I think it's worth reflecting on. When we talk about quote unquote the other, what we are doing metaphorically is pointing to all of those characteristics that are imposed on the marginalised side of that binary we've been talking about previously. So remember when we talked about binaries, we said, in the Western tradition, there is this very much this sort of logic that underpins a lot of the language, where it sets it up through a series of contrasts. Good, evil, man, woman, reason, emotion, black, white, on and on and on. So the binary itself is that structure, but the point that follows up quickly from that is that this is not an evenly balanced structure. one side of the binary, which connects itself, there is a sort of an inherent logic to that powerful or dominant side, imposes its will on the other side, and it dominates that other side. So that not only do you understand individual sort of steps or rungs of that ladder, or whatever metaphor you want to use, but the way that each side of the binary then draws on those other ideas to reinforce their positions. One of the great statements of this, exposing the logic of this way of thinking, comes from Simone de Beauvoir in the introduction to her book, The Second Sex. So this is very much talking about the underlying logic of otherness, and in this case, how it works or how it plays itself out when we think about the relationship between women and men. So de Beauvoir says, thus humanity is male, and man defines woman not in herself, but as relative to him. She is not regarded as an autonomous being. Man can think of himself without woman. She cannot think of herself without man. She is defined and differentiated with reference to man, and not he with reference to her. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. So this way, I guess, captures exactly what it is we're trying to expose with that idea of binaries, and thinking about the way they cluster these things together. Man is rational, powerful, absolute. Women, in this sense, are then the sort of the shadow of that idea, clustering in that more marginalised way and asserting themselves in that more limited set of capacities. De Beauvoir's point here is that this way of thinking has been baked into a lot of society, social institutions, the way that we think about other people and the way that we think about ourselves as well. So again, it sort of draws together many of these ideas that we've been talking about. So that has been our first foray into thinking about sameness and difference in a general sense. From next week, we begin looking more closely at specific topic areas and the way that these ideas play themselves out in people's very real lived experience. Our focus there is on social class, which provides a useful context, I think, for thinking about sameness and difference, privilege and disadvantage in people's everyday experience. See you then.